Welcome everybody. My name is Stephanie Cadaval, and I'm the Urban Forest Extension Coordinator here at the University of Florida. And we're based out of the School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatic Sciences. And I want to thank you for joining us for our Urban Forestry Extension Council Speaker Series event. And as I mentioned earlier, we've got some folks from around Florida, and it looks like we have someone from Canada joining us as well, which is really great. And our event is formatted as a lunch and learn, so you're going to hear from an invited speaker, and then we're all going to engage in conversation with them and with each other about the topic that we just learned about. It may be a little more casual than your typical presentation, and you are encouraged to bring and eat your lunch if you'd like. I will ask that as you listen to our speaker, that you please share your questions in the chat. Um, that way we can address them at the end of our meeting in our questions and conversations portion of our chat. And we'll also be recording the presentation so that we can share it later on our website. And then finally, since this is a new series, it is really important for us to collect some feedback from everyone. So at the end of the event, we'll try to leave about 5 minutes or so. That will allow us to wrap up, and then I'll share with you all a very brief survey, a quick little exit slip that's going to just help us learn about your experience and help us shape future events like this one and hopefully continue to offer events like this. All right, and then welcome if you've just joined us. If you go ahead and share your name and where you're from in the chat. And then without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and share or introduce our speaker, invited speaker, who's Christian Wanamaker. Christian is the coordinator for the UF Invasive Species survey group, a volunteer group which conducts surveys on public and private lands for invasive species so land managers can create or improve their land management plans. He recruits and trains volunteers to work with land managers and increase reporting of invasive species on these managed lands. Christian is also a master's student here at the University of Florida, and he's studying invasive species ecology. And previously, he worked for the Non-Native Fish and Wildlife Program at the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. So welcome, Christian.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction, Stephanie. And thanks so much for organizing this. I really appreciate the idea of having a lunch and learn. I think it's a really exciting idea, and I'm happy to share some of the work that I do and some more information about invasive species reporting. So yeah, as Stephanie mentioned, I'm the coordinator for the invasive species survey, and what I wanted to do today is share some of the tools that folks can use for reporting invasive species wherever they find them. So we're going to start off actually with a little bit of terminology because I find that this is an area where there's a lot of confusion even among professional folks and even in peer-reviewed literature. Where you find some really inconsistent terminology use. So I usually like to start by asking a question about whether or not native species can be invasive. And I'll let you just kind of think about it a little bit for just a moment. And I know it's kind of cheating because I haven't given you any definitions yet. But I usually find that this is a good starting off point and it addresses some of the misconceptions that we have or some of the confusion that we have around these concepts. So the answer really no. Native species cannot be invasive because by definition, invasive species are non-native species. Now, I'll give you definitions in a moment, but I like to start off really with this overarching definition for invasive species, right? Where we're talking about a non-native species which has been introduced to an area, whether that was intentionally or unintentionally, and that organism is causing or is suspected of causing impacts or consequences. Typically, we group those consequences into these three areas of impacts to our environment, impacts to our economy, or impacts to human health. So that's a pretty big definition, multiple parts, lots of criteria, but it kind of shows you that what we're dealing with is a subset of non-native species rather than all of them. And kind of just to keep driving this home, there's more terminology that I like to kind of run through, and I'll give you some of the breakdowns for the key terms in that invasive species definition. So we talk about native species. We're talking about species or organisms which have been historically present in an area. When I talk about historical, I like to use the criteria of that these historically present species share an evolutionary history with other species in that area. Um, Bouncing off of that, then we have non-native species. These are species that are historically absent. And if we're talking about an introduced to non-native species, these are species, again, which have been brought to an area, whether that was intentionally or unintentionally. And then we have those invasive species, right? That's the subset even further of non-native and introduced species, and that's those that are, again, having consequences or suspected of having consequences. Really critically here, if we're talking about a native species, which is behaving in an annoying way, we don't want to call it invasive. Instead, we probably just call it a weed, right? A weed is kind of just a catch-all term for a plant that's growing where we don't want it. And that can be applied regardless of whether it's native or non-native. So I think that's an important kind of category to include. Um, we're also trying to, as we are moving towards a more concise and consistent terminology around invasive species issues, we're starting to move away from certain terminology as well. So exotic is a good example of this. You'll still see this in peer-reviewed literature and in historical documents about invasive species and weeds. But in my mind, it's not a very precise term. It almost describes more of an aesthetic than an actual definition. I also am going to skip down to alien because that always conjures for me the idea of a little green man. I don't think that's a particularly helpful descriptor for species. And then I really would like to resist against the urge for folks of referring to native species as native invasives, right? We just talked about that being kind of a conflicting terminology, and we're really talking about just a native species that's behaving like a weed. Now, Florida, because it's where I work and that's kind of the focus of my presentation today, has a pretty ginormous invasive species issue. And I'm going to focus just on plants because that's really, my bread and butter, although I can speak to some of the other invasive species issues here too. Um, but just looking at those plants, we have about 168 invasive plant species in the state of Florida. And those 168 plant species are responsible for something like 43% of the habitat loss for our native, threatened, and endangered species. We also spend a ton of money managing these species, or we lose money from lost yields to invasive plant species in our state. And then just a little bit more context, pointing out how bad Florida is relative to everywhere else. This is from a research paper that came out in 2017, so it's already a little bit aged, to be honest. But I like envisioning these global invasion hotspots across the globe, and pointing out that really invasive species move with people. Typically, what you're seeing is areas that are hotspots of trade, that have a lot of ports or huge amounts of import-export economic activity tend to be areas that have a lot of invasive species. And Florida is right there among them. So this kind of just points out, the context of why Florida is such an important and great spot to be talking about invasive species issues, and why it's really important that we get a handle on them here, because invasive species don't like to stay still. We don't want something that's in Florida to become a problem in Georgia or Alabama or further. So I also like to ask folks, what do you do when you encounter invasive species, right? And I recognize that this is your response is going to be different based off of what your job is and what your level of experience and expertise is. But typically, I like to remind people that it depends on where you are and where, like physically, what kind of property are you on. And so if you're at home, I encourage you to remove it. Do whatever you can to get rid of it. If you're finding an invasive species on a neighbor's property, you probably are not going to want to just yank it or remove it. You're going to want to talk to them and say like, hey, did you know this? Would it be possible for you to get rid of it before it comes into my yard? Whatever. Even offer to help them. That's always a great spot to start too. But if you're in a park, a community spot, or a public land, you really don't want to be, again, removing things. There's always the risk that maybe you've misidentified something. Maybe by creating an amount of disturbance, you're actually going to encourage another weed to move in. So we really don't want to encourage folks to go into these public spaces and actively remove species. So instead, we really want folks to report it. And by report it, I don't mean go find your nearest park ranger and flag them down and be like, hey, did you know that you have, this camphor tree here? I suppose you could, but more than likely, that's not the most effective way to report it. So this is how I'm going to pivot into the rest of the presentation, which is really about different reporting tools that we have. And one of the big reporting tools that I like to advocate for and that I work with a lot is EDDMaps. So EDDMaps is, this is the screenshot of the homepage of their website. EDDMaps is a online invasive species database that's managed by the University of Georgia. Excuse me. And EDDMaps has really broad coverage. It has data that spans across the entire United States into Canada, and I understand they're going to eventually have some support for Mexico as well. So what they're really trying to do is build this database of invasive species occurrence across the entirety of the continent. And this is a really fantastic resource for land managers and for anyone who's interested in learning about invasive species to visit and pull data, and you can see a lot of different information about the distribution of invasive species. What's also really powerful about it, and I'll talk a lot about this today, is all the different ways that people, individuals, you can contribute to this project. So this is the homepage for EDDMaps, as I mentioned. I'm going to quickly show you like just a very quick breakdown of some of the things that you can do here. So if you go to their distribution maps tab up the top navigation ribbon, it'll bring you to this page, which is this page is replicated in a number of different areas. So this is a pretty common search menu for different species. Now, I mentioned that the species in EDDMaps, it covers the entirety of, let's just say for the continent, for argument's sake. So there's a very good chance that you're going to have to do some filtering to get to species that you're interested in. So just stick with it. But once you have a species, you can select a species here, and you can see on the right-hand side, there's under that view tab, there's a lot of different options: state, county, point, list, whatever. And these are all different ways of viewing the data that's behind the scenes. So if we were to click on a species, on the right-hand side here, I just picked a ligustrum species, and this is a county level map where they show the density of the amount of records per county. So this gives you a really nice sneak peek into where these species are being reported, in this case, ligustrum, and it can give you a sense for probably where the density, the most core infested areas of this species are. In reality, what you're looking at, of course, are observations or records. So if you just have counties where people aren't reporting it, you might have kind of a blank spot, which is why we're really trying to encourage as many folks as possible to report to this. I should mention this is also a free database. You can use this data for free. You can create an account for free. You're going to need to create an account to report species and to do some of the exporting data features. But it's otherwise completely free to use and very accessible. As far as data quality, I also like to just let people know how it works. We have two different user roles within EDDMaps. We have reporters and verifiers, and these are just different classes of users of the website. So reporters are anybody who has an account who's submitting data, but verifiers have an additional kind of credential to their account, and basically verifiers are users who have reached out to the University of Georgia and said, hey, I am, an expert in whatever field or topic of invasive species or identification. I'd like to verify data. And what this means is that anytime a reporter sends in data, before that report goes into the public-facing website, all the verifiers in that little area of expertise get dinged and are asked to review records before they can become public. So this is kind of their internal data verification process. And it just helps to ensure that all the records that go into EDDMaps and that become publicly visible have had a second set of eyes on them, basically, just to kind of help make sure that the data is robust and reliable. This is just one example of the products that EDDMaps can produce. There's also point maps, and there's also some really interesting map products that focus on more analysis-based things, so looking at things like spread of species over time, or even for certain species, there's been an expansion of models that predict how species could expand over time with climate change. So there's a number of really, really cool products that are baked into EDDMaps, and this is just an example of what we can do with some of the data that's being contributed to this project. I also like to ask people how you report species, because there are a lot of tools out there for sort of citizen science reporting of not just invasive species, of course, that's what I'm focusing on today. But I think it's helpful to point out that a lot of the tools, at least that I'm familiar with and that most folks are using, are in some way related. So I'll point out that iNaturalist is the only one in the short list that I have here, which is not actually run by all the same folks. iNaturalist is its own project, and obviously does not focus on invasive species. It's just for biodiversity reporting, writ large. Um, but EDDMaps, I've got one, WildSpotter. These are a couple of different like mobile-based applications that can be used for this kind of reporting, and they all feed into the core EDDMaps database. And I'll talk. What I'm really going to do is break down some of these apps now, and kind of explain some of the differences between them, and maybe help you think about why you might choose using one app over another. So at its core, the sort of entry app for EDDMaps reporting is just called EDDMaps. It's a little bit confusing, I fully admit, but this is kind of geared towards beginners or volunteers or anybody who just wants to start contributing information. Uh, when you log on, again, you're going to have to create an account to use this application. When you log on, it's going to ask you to choose your state. That way it kind of narrows down the list of species that it's going to offer for your reporting. And then I have on the right here basically just two different screenshots from the app. And you can see on the left-hand side is sort of the home screen of the app. It's very simple. And what's nice about this is on the top part, you have those report observation options. But in the EDDMaps app, you also have the species information tabs below. And this helps someone who is maybe not certain what they're looking at to open, like, say, a plant list, if you're looking at a plant, and scroll through the options of invasive plants that have been documented in your state. And that is a great way to help you kind of filter down your options. And actually, I didn't include it, but if you click plants, it even gives you a step further of like, are you looking at a vine, a tree, a bush, that can kind of help you work your way through an identification process. So I'll also share quickly here on this slide how to submit a record, because this process is going to be very similar across all the different EDDMaps applications. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to click your new sighting tab. After that, it's going to bring you to the screenshot on the right. Okay, this is like a data entry form. Your next step is going to be to select a subject. So by selecting a subject, you're going to tap in that area and it's going to open a drop-down menu. And again, it's going to show you all the different species that are in your area. You can also begin just typing the name of something and it will automatically start to filter that list. So if you have an idea, of what you're looking at, you can start to search for it. After you've chosen the object that you're trying to report or the organism that you're trying to report, it's going to ask you to include a picture. Now, this is really important for us data verifiers, because if you are just someone I don't know and you're reporting something, I don't have any way to verify this. So it's really, really important for the data that's coming in to have an associated photo, and preferably a photo that's like some decent quality, right? You like the subject to be in focus, so that anybody can come behind you, any verifier can come behind you, look at that, and say, oh yes, that is definitely what you're looking at. You have the option, I should mention too, to add multiple photos. It's not just one. So if you feel free to, add more. More is better in this case. And then the last step that you really need to do is just hit the save button. You're free to enter information about how long you spent surveying if you want to do that. Infestation status, we're going to leave that to positive because you're just reporting something. And then there's a little notes field if you want to add some information. You'll notice that observation date and your location are automatically saved when you're using the app. So that's the spatial and temporal data that's being captured as soon as you make a record. So this is the EDDMaps app. It's meant for basically anybody to get involved. It's sort of the easiest to use of the apps. And I think it's fairly intuitive and user-friendly. But after that, I'm going to talk also about the I've Got One app. So this is still feeding into the EDDMaps database. This is just a different application that was produced by the EDDMaps folks at the University of Georgia. And this one was built specifically for Florida in mind. This was also a collaborative partnership with Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Again, it's really simple and I think user-friendly, again, geared towards more beginners and volunteers or anyone, members of the public who just see something that they want to report. Because it's Florida specific, there's no need to choose your state. It already kind of defaults to all of Florida species. It still includes, in this case, instead of like species information, it's called field guide. And you can see that in that left-hand screenshot. And you can navigate using the bottom menu of tabs. If you go to the Explore tab, which is just to the right there, you'll see this map view that I have in the middle screenshot. And I think this is also a really cool way to visualize what's been reported in your community already. And then if you want to add a record, you're going to hit the little brownish green plus sign in the center there, and it's going to bring you to that very familiar subject reporting data entry form. EDDMaps Pro then is now we're getting into the more professional and advanced suite of tools for reporting invasive species. And this is really, it's a little bit more complicated and it's less user friendly, but the trade-off is that there's a lot of features that are sort of baked into EDDMaps Pro to help professionals and land managers with their work. On the right-hand side, I have just an example of some of those different tabs. I'm not going to go into all of them. EDDMaps has some really fantastic training materials, and also if you're interested in using this app, feel free to reach out and I can help you help set you up and kind of guide you through the process. But I just like to point out a few things, right? So this has support for using offline maps. So if you're working in areas where you have really poor connection or service, you can still use this app to collect and record data and also to navigate to some extent. There are also some additional data fields in the data collection form. I didn't include these, but a lot of them have to do with the spatial extent. So if you're reporting, instead of just dropping a pin, you have a way of saying, at this point, there is an acre of, a plant or whatever. So there's a little bit more flexibility with how you enter the forms. And then also there's really cool support for doing what are called revisits. And this is really helpful for land managers who are going out and perhaps removing or spraying herbicide on invasive species. Because when you drop a point, say you're out surveying, you can drop a point one day and you can say, I got to come back here next week and spray this. Well, you have your point, you can go back to it. And then when you go back to it, instead of dropping another point, you're going to want to just access the existing point, do what's called a revisit, and then you can mark it as being sprayed, right? Or you can mark it as being treated in some way. So this kind of just helps with keeping data clean. So you don't have just dozens of points dropped all over your maps for each visit. Instead, you can just enter these like temporal sort of files in your filing system of management, which it just, as I said, helps for data organization and keeping a very clear record of what kind of activity you're doing. Also, what's missing from the EDDMaps Pro app is any kind of identification support. So there's no field guide, there's no species information. We kind of assume that if you're working at this level, you have a pretty good idea of what you're going to be looking at and reporting. So just another reason why we recommend it really for professional and advanced users. And then one last option, this is a relatively new option called WildSpotter. Again, this is still being incorporated into the EDDMaps database. But instead of the difference with this app versus the other sort of beginning and volunteer apps is that this is a really place-based reporting system. So the other apps, you can go anywhere in your neighborhood, in your park, whatever, and report something. With WildSpotter, what you need is someone who's going to sort of act as a data custodian in your area. So this would be like a park manager, for example, or a park biologist. And what they need to do is set up a wild area or a wild place. And that is basically just like dropping a polygon on a location that is their responsibility to manage. And then what's really nice about this is you have only what's really being reported in that specific area. And so when volunteers or members of the public come in, if you want them to report things in that specific area, you could have something like a little sign on your entry kiosk saying, hey, download this app and choose this wild area and help us report and monitor invasive species in this area. So it's a really cool feature. It's also, very intuitive and has all the species information and all that kind of information. You can also add information about your wild place if you want to include things about site uses. Maybe you're managing for timber recreation and you want to talk about that. There's a lot of really cool things that you can move into this. Like I said, it does kind of require having a data custodian, so that's maybe a little bit of an extra step. And the other thing that I was going to point out, just I'm based out of Gainesville, Florida, and when I open my Wild Places app, I see the list of places on the far right, and the nearest places to me are Osceola and Ocala, 50 plus miles away. So this really is something where you need that data manager to create a space. But if you have someone who's devoted and responsible for a specific location, it's a great option for reporting. So those are the apps that we have. I think it's really important to emphasize the role and the importance of citizen scientists and this kind of participatory science framework as force multipliers for invasive species management. I really like to encourage folks to use these tools solo if they like to. It is still helpful if you are, just walking the dog and you see something and you want to report it. But also, there's a lot of impact to be done in joining groups. And so, just as some examples, again, in Florida, I'm emphasizing Florida, we have these organizations called SISMAs. These are cooperative invasive species management areas. And I'll maybe show you a map of those later, at least in Florida. These are sort of voluntary professional organizations of just whoever is doing invasive species management in that SISMA area. So a lot of times you do get whatever kind of public agencies that are involved, you get private landowners who are involved, and the idea is to share information and expertise about invasive species issues, and sometimes even sharing resources around invasive species issues in your area. So this is a great network of folks to get involved with, and even if you're outside of Florida, SISMAs are not uncommon in other states as well. So there's a very good chance that you can find a local SISMA to get involved with. I'll say that we usually think about SISMAs sort of at county level, although we do have like larger regional SISMAs that are multi-county. Um, so yeah, just great organizations to get involved with. Also, don't underestimate Native Plant Society chapters. This is also another group or organization that exists in most states in the US, where you can tap into really passionate individuals who are interested in plant identification and conservation of natural areas. And so they tend to be really wonderful volunteers to encourage this kind of reporting. Also, again, in Florida, UF IFAS has a number of volunteer programs, including the Florida Master Naturalists and Master Gardeners. These are also great groups that I like to target and share this information about how to report and get involved and participating in this process. And then the last thing that I'm going to talk about today is really my organization and the UF Invasive Species Survey, because what we're doing is a little bit different from just going out and adventitiously reporting things. And to start off, I like to show this is broadly my project area, and this is a map of all the conservation lands in North Florida. And I do this just to highlight that there's really a tremendous amount of acreage out there that is in some way, shape, or form being managed for conservation or being proposed for conservation. And realistically, there is not a lot of people who are involved in doing that conservation work relative to the acreage. And land management is a huge job. There is so much to be done, especially in Florida, where we are, in most cases, trying to bring prescribed fire back into these landscapes. We're doing things like managing habitat for threatened species conservation. We're creating new wildlife habitat. On a lot of properties in Florida, we also have things like timber production being a real core land management goal. And then I tend to forget about this as well. I'm guilty of this, but a lot of these lands are also managed for recreation, and they have all these mixed use needs and goals. And what we find is that invasive species management is really critical at each and every one of these levels, right? No matter what your management goals are for a piece of land, you're going to need to think about invasive species management in some way, shape, or form. So we already have a small staff of people and a huge acreage doing all this work, and now we're saying we have this growing problem of invasive species that we also need to tackle. So in my mind, this really just highlights the need for getting the public involved in this process. So we did a sort of needs assessment at the University of Florida and tried to figure out like what shape would a citizen science project really look like, and what could we do to really realistically help this issue. And we found that there were a couple of gaps identified from this needs assessment. The first of which is that we were interested, or that land managers were really interested in knowing what kind of species that they needed to manage, especially in Florida, where it feels like we always have a new invasive species of the month. It can be really hard to just kind of stay on top of things. Um, Obviously, land managers also need to know where these species are occurring. If you're managing a huge tract like a national forest with many, many management zones, and you say you're only in each management zone once every 3 years, that's a huge amount of land and time that it spends just kind of keeping track of where things are at. And then even when you've gotten to the point where you're ready to manage invasive species and do herbicide applications and do manual removals, you also need to revisit those areas, unfortunately, to make sure that your management plans are actually working. a lot of times, well, actually, I think in 99% of the cases with invasive species, you can't spray something once and expect that your problem is gone. You have to revisit it. You have to revisit it and stay on top of it because there's a seed bank or something will, resprout from a stump. So it's really, really vital that you're keeping on top. If you're spending the time and the resources to manage it, you want to make sure that it's going to be effective. Um, and so from all these different needs, we really decided that this was a good opportunity for citizen science data collection. But really the disjoint was in where people are reporting species and where land managers needed information to be generated. So that's really where we came up with this idea of the invasive species survey. So this is a volunteer group that is based out of North Florida as of right now. For our inaugural few years, we're focusing in this area. And the whole idea is that we train and recruit volunteers to do surveys and map invasive plant infestations within these counties. I mentioned SISMAs earlier. The shades of the counties represent different SISMA areas. So I'm working across 3 different SISMAs just to kind of give you an idea of how these organizations kind of overlap. So this is a service that we do for free, doing these surveys. Public and private lands are both eligible for this. So we're happy to work with private landowners, and we're also happy to work with public land managers, kind of at all levels, whether they're federal, state, local, doesn't matter. And the difference, from what a lot of citizen science projects versus what we do is really my role, where as a coordinator, I'm doing direct coordination with the land managers who are interested, and we're identifying, hey, what are your management goals? What are your needs? And then where do you need volunteers on the ground? Because it often isn't in, a residential neighborhood. It's often in the middle of a forest. That's really where they need volunteers. So what I do is kind of take those needs and pair them with the volunteers who are trained to do these kinds of surveys, and we generate that data where they need it most. So for training volunteers, I've put together a free online short course that we use to train volunteers. It's organized into 3 different modules. The first of which kind of just covers invasive species issues very broadly, and kind of introduces folks to terminology, make sure that volunteers can communicate effectively about, the work that they're doing and explain the importance of it. The second part focuses on learning to identify about a dozen invasive plant species here in North Florida. These are typically the species that land managers are most concerned about managing and documenting. And we have some flexibility. If you have a species that we don't have on our list, you could just communicate with that with me, and I can put together training materials to make sure that we're covered. And then the third module covers using EDDMaps Pro, right, which I mentioned is a little bit more complicated. It's geared towards professionals. So it takes a little bit of training to get volunteers to really feel comfortable collecting high quality data in that app. The whole course is really meant to take about 3 hours, but the idea is that as it's an asynchronous course, you can complete it at your own pace. So there's no rush or whatever. But the whole idea is that after taking this course, you'll be pretty well set to go out and do some surveying. As far as what our surveys actually look like, so that's our work process follows with land managers will reach out to me and request a survey. They can go through our website to request a survey, and they kind of delineate where they're interested in that survey being done. I work together with volunteers in the area to schedule a work day where we can actually go out and do that survey. We'll meet at the site, and basically all that I ask of volunteers is that they come dressed for field work in Florida. And really all that we need is a phone for collecting data because we're using the EDDMaps Pro phone application. Otherwise, it's for the most part just a pretty leisurely hike, and we just report what we see, and it ends up being a lot of fun, and we see a lot of really cool habitat, which is a really exciting process for us as well. And you never really know what you're going to find. So even though we're there focusing on invasive species, we see lots of unusual or uncommon species. And I think it's just a great way to highlight the importance of these conservation areas. And it gives volunteers kind of a rush to know, like, hey, you're helping to protect this space. And it also is a space that is off the beaten path, that is really important for us to preserve in some way. And then after the survey, we take the information that we collect, the data that we collect, and I can share it with land managers who requested that survey so that they can use this information to help put together a management plan or to help, keep track of their existing management plan. Is it working? Because, just as an example, this was a survey that we did out at Union's Lake, not too far from Gainesville, where they had actually gone through, they had contractors go through and treat a number of invasive species. And this was maybe 6 months out. They were wondering if the contractors had missed anything, if everything was sort of responding to herbicide the way that they had expected. So they asked us to basically go out and help collect data to answer that question, right? Are our management actions actually working? So this was really exciting that we were able to collect this data and share it with them after the fact. And as I mentioned, there's something that's very iterative about this process of managing invasive species, where it's never just like a one and done process. You always have to plan revisits, and we really see having these volunteers as an integral part of that iterative process, because this is a group of folks who can help kind of multiply your human power out there and save you time and a bit of effort and money, because again, it's a free service that we're offering. So we really hope that it's something that folks can take advantage of. Um, and also, I don't know, it's worth mentioning too, different agencies have different needs when it comes to how data is collected. And in general, we find that EDDMaps is really well suited for a lot of agency needs. And it's not difficult to teach private landowners how to use it too, even if they're completely unfamiliar with this process. But we have a lot of flexibility in how we collect and share that data. And EDDMaps is also pretty flexible. So I always encourage folks, even if you don't know anything about these programs or these tools, to have a conversation with me and let me know what your needs are, and we can usually figure something out. So our website is kind of our hub here. I encourage folks to go to our website, which I'll have a QR code to at the end. This is just a quick example for our volunteer page, encouraging folks to go to the volunteer tab, and they can submit that volunteer interest form so that I can get them onboarded. Also for land managers, we likewise have a different tab for land managers to go through and request a survey on their property. It's a different data entry form. They basically just give me some contact information, some information about their goals and the location that they want to have surveyed. And then I really want to emphasize, in the early parts of this project, we are staying very focused on North Florida, right? Most of our survey events are happening in North Florida. I'm doing a lot of speaking engagements across North Florida, but just because you're not based in North Florida doesn't mean that we can't be helpful in some way, shape, or form. So please, if this is at all a process that you're interested in, reach out to me. There's some amount of support and information that I can share about EDDMaps, about invasive species reporting, about citizen science. Like, just reach out. I like to be a resource for anybody who's interested in doing this kind of work. So with that, that's largely what I wanted to run through. There's the QR code to the website. I think that actually takes you to the volunteer page, just a heads up. I have some contact information there. And yeah, I understand that we have some sort of guided questions now that we can walk through, and I'll take any questions too.
Great. Thanks so much, Christian. Yeah, so we do have, we had a question in the chat, but you did answer it while you were presenting. And we have a couple of questions just kind of to get folks thinking about how they might apply some of this in their own areas.
Sure.
If you just give me a thumbs up if you're looking at my shared screen. Are you seeing?
I'll stop sharing and maybe you can take over. Okay.
Okay. Are you seeing a Slido? Yes,
Yes.
Rachel? Okay, great. So one of the questions that we have for everyone in the room is, what kinds of invasive species occur in your communities? And of course, we're thinking largely here in urban forests.
And Stephanie, we can scan the QR code or go to the Slido address, right, to do this?
That's correct. You can scan the QR code or you can go to slido.com and put in this number down here, 206620 or 245.
Oh yeah, Brazilian pepper, air potato, yeah, notorious.
And I think also if you're seeing some on that are listed on here that you also have in your community, if you add it as well, it will kind of show it so it's like a different level. And that will give us a sense of what kinds of things we see more often.
Ooh. Yeah, so I'm seeing a lot of plants here, which definitely heads up for this audience. Spongy moth is a cool one. I'm glad to see that there's multiple, there's attention to multiple taxa. And something I maybe didn't emphasize quite enough is that EDDMaps is not just plant specific. I use it for plants primarily, but there is support for all different kinds of organisms, whether that's Burmese pythons in the Everglades, uh, or insect pests, even in agricultural areas. The idea is that if it's an organism that has some kind of impact, that it can likely be reported through EDDMaps, and it's going to be helpful to researchers or to managers in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and change to the next one. So now we kind of have a sense of what kinds of vegetation or other species are invasive in the areas that we all live and work in. But what kinds of tools have you used so far to identify some of these species if you didn't know what they were? Or maybe tools that you recommend to others?
I like using placards in parks. That's definitely a cool idea. And that's very helpful. A great way to get like the public to be kind of engaged and keyed in onto things. But of course, you run the risk of, if someone, if they don't see the placard or they see a species in an area before they get to the placard, that's where something like WildSpotter is really cool because you have that list of species in the app, right? Or you can add those species to the app, and they can just kind of check their phone as they go, and can identify things that way. I also see Seek. Yeah, so Seek, and I was hoping someone would say like iNaturalist or something to that effect. So EDDMaps does not have sort of like that AI identification element right now. Um, I don't know if that's something that they're necessarily interested in incorporating. I haven't heard one way or another if they're going to do that. It's definitely a useful feature. There are some groups where, well, here's the weakness with that, with invasive species. If you have a new invasive species, a lot of those models that iNaturalists, for example, are using is based off of the frequency of things being reported in your area. And so if you have something that has not been very well documented, the likelihood that you're going to get a suggestion for that species is a little bit lower. And there are certain taxonomic groups that are also really hard to identify. So right now I'm working with some invasive grasses that are underreported right now and are moving through North Florida. And iNaturalists cannot, for the most part, identify grasses with any great degree of reliability. Um, so that's also something to be aware of. Is it depends on the taxonomic group. Um, so also there's something to be said about the data verification process between iNaturalist and EDDMaps. Not that one is necessarily better than the other, but that they are different. So EDDMaps, remember, you have these verifiers who are they've requested the status. They have to submit some credential to the EDDMaps folks to let them know, like, hey, I do work in this field. I have some expertise, and then they have to review records. Versus iNaturalist, you have those two kind of corroborated identifications that are what takes a record from just an observation to a research grade observation. Um, so just a couple of differences to sort of be aware of.
Yeah, thanks for that, Christian. We have in the chat a comment from Rachel. She's talking about her experience in the parks in Pinellas County. and says that most of them have placards along trails that show photos of invasive species, natives, and benefits of dead or dying trees, etc.
I love that. Yeah, that's awesome. I'm glad that you have the sort of support and expertise to put those resources together for folks who are going through trails.
Yeah, absolutely. And Christian, this kind of makes me think of some questions that I came up with while you were presenting. And I'm wondering if there are things that make invasive species management or even identification more or less difficult in urban areas rather than in less urban areas.
So yes, I don't know that urban areas make identification a whole lot more difficult, but definitely the management is a lot more difficult. So in more urban areas, typically what you get is smaller unit or parcel sizes that are managed by different entities. This means that there are more boundaries and more people that you have to get kind of onboarded if you want to do any kind of large scale community management of invasive species. And invasive species don't care, right? They don't care if it's your yard, your neighbor's yard, the county's property, the right of way that's managed by the county or Department of Transportation, it's going to invade all these areas. And if you're not able to manage it across that entire area, then you're not going to really have huge success, right? If you can manage it only up to a property line, but it's right on the other adjacent property, it's gonna be very hard to get any kind of meaningful control of that species. Um, so yeah, and then even management activities that aren't specific towards invasive species but are very helpful, like prescribed fire, is can be really difficult, right? In urban areas, there's a lot of sort of safety precautions that we have to use or put into place before we can do things like use prescribed fire to manage habitat. So that's just another kind of consideration in urban areas.
Yeah, and I have a maybe a follow-up question to that is, so considering that you have to get so many more people on board
Mhm.
to make some of these management decisions, what are some of the ways that we can maybe further involve the public or engage the public in this management process for invasive species?
Yeah, yeah. So I think that's one of the great ways. Like these tools are very helpful and important, right, for collecting data and making management decisions. But when we involve the public in this sort of participatory science framework, what we're also doing is educating them, right? And we're teaching them about invasive species. We're teaching them how to recognize the things that are around them and to care about their natural places. And I think that it kind of follows this natural progression of folks getting more and more involved in these issues. And so if you're in an urban area and you're trying to improve the management of invasive species in your urban area, if you have more people who are keyed in, who are reporting things, you can also communicate with them about doing things like, well, talk to your neighbors, get them involved, right? Creating sort of like this idea of herd immunity in your communities against invasive species. And then at that point, too, you can even get folks together and go to your county offices or your city offices, right? And kind of democratize this approach towards managing invasive species where you can kind of break down those barriers, those geographic barriers, and try to get some more landscape level control.
Yeah. We have a question in the chat here. So this person is asking about hybridization and if hybridization of invasive plants with natives is an issue, and if it
Mhm.
happens, does that make identification more challenging?
Yeah, that is a very good point. So lantana is a very good example of this, right? We have lantana camara or lantana striga camara, which is an invasive shrubby plant here in Florida. But we also have a native lantana species, Lantana depressa, which is much smaller status. And both plants are used in landscaping to some extent, and we know that they hybridize. And when they hybridize, the flower color is really inconsistent. So what used to be, you could rely on flower color to distinguish between the native and the invasive. Now you're getting these hybrids, and sometimes it becomes really hard to make sure that what you're selling, if you're a nurseryman or a nursery person, is truly the native variety, or if you're kind of just creating a weird hybrid situation. So yeah, that does make challenging or make identification much more challenging. And that's probably the best example I have off the top of my head. But yeah, and we even have sometimes this is a step beyond that question, but because Florida is this hub of um, trade and bringing in different species, again, intentionally or unintentionally, whether that's for horticultural purposes or as like a hitchhiker. We do have records of invasive plants that have been introduced at two different points of entry and that have two different origins. It's the same species, but they come from two different locations. And so what you have is potentially, and there's some really cool research on this for Brazilian pepper and for Kogan grass, these same species that have been introduced in multiple areas from different source locations that have different genetic material, and that there is a real risk for hybridization. And when a lot of these invasive species hybridize, they have something that's called hybrid vigor. They tend to grow stronger, grow bigger, be harder to treat, be more resilient to things like drought or frost. And so, you can think about all the different complicated ways that hybridization can affect invasion outcomes. And it's usually not good news for us, unfortunately. It's almost always a new challenge for management or identification, as we pointed out.
Yeah, that was a great question. Are there any other questions from the group? Or even some examples like from your own areas? As people are thinking about that, Christian, I wonder if you could give your 2 cents on how can we make, because the idea is to remove invasive species whenever possible, but then also removal isn't just enough, right? You have to also replace
Yes.
in cases. And
Yes.
so I'm wondering how would you say would be a way that we can bring more people on board or make native options more attractive for people?
Yeah. So, I mean, first, I want to emphasize that is a really important point, right? Removal is only a part of the equation. The most effective sort of landscape level restoration focuses not just on the removal of an invasive species or an undesirable species, but you do have to replace it in some way, shape, or form. And we really want to emphasize or encourage folks to use native plant species to do that replacement. It creates better habitat. And I think sometimes, to answer your question more directly, expounding the benefits of native plants is really helpful, right? We can talk about how a lot of native plants are better adapted to our specific environment because they are historically present here. They're used to these conditions. Um, we can also talk about the role that our native plants play in creating habitat or food, the kind of the ecosystem services level for wildlife, not just for your aesthetics, but also again thinking about the ecology of your community and how you're contributing in some way by planting natives. And I think that increasingly there are programs out there that are looking at making these native plants much more available, right? So I know there are city and county programs to help you with trees. They supply you with trees if you can kind of sponsor them and take care of them. Um, there's a lot of work going on also, I think, about within our own department about making native ground cover options more available, which historically is something that has not been very available. So I think kind of just tapping into these sort of opportunities to learn more and to have access to these resources is really important.
Yeah, definitely. So we're coming up on the end of our presentation here. I want to just give one more chance for folks to ask any questions that they have. If you have anything in you can drop it in the chat or you can unmute yourself. Or if you have any examples of using some of these tools, maybe that Christian spoke about, that would be great to share as well.
I want to emphasize again, I know I said it, but if you're curious more about any of these tools, if you are interested in trying to develop a citizen science program, like absolutely please reach out. I think it's always really exciting to like learn what other folks have in mind, to think about like what form and what shape a program could look like in your community where it could be very helpful. And I'd love to, be able to support you in some way in that. So don't hesitate to reach out and ask questions.
Yeah, I was thinking, Christian, as you were presenting and you were talking about the Wild Spotter
Yeah,
program, and I was thinking about, well, that would be so cool for like local tree steward groups or someone like that who's maybe adopted a park or adopted an area to kind of
yeah.
manage a mini, like, a mini little geographic space where they can keep track of what kinds of invasive trees there are, invasive vegetation there is.
Yes, and that's also one of the ideas that we have with the survey group right now. Is I cover a pretty large geographic area, and it's very difficult for me, for example, to be out in the Panhandle all the time. So the idea was to kind of create these sort of like friends of groups where they can use the training that we provide, but they can kind of take agency and ownership over a local area that they're concerned about and that they want to help survey and monitor pretty regularly. And that way I don't necessarily need to be at all those events. They can, work kind of semi-autonomously just with me providing some of the coordination and reaching out to land managers to let them know that this is an option for them.
Yeah, definitely. So I'm going to go ahead and share again just for our wrap up. All right. So you should be seeing my screen here. I just want to remind everyone, thanks everyone, first of all, for all your questions and ideas. And thank you so much, Christian, for sharing with us. But I want to go ahead and share our next speaker coming up. So our next speaker is going to be Taylor Clem, who's an extension agent in Nassau County. And they'll be talking about community conservation efforts. So they're going to be sharing a case study on an area of southern Amelia Island where the community has come together to protect a span of urban canopy. I think that will be pretty interesting. And if you want to register for any of the remaining talks that we've got coming up, you can scan this QR code on the bottom of the screen. Oops. And then Christian's talk, along with some of our past talks, are going to be available on our School of Forest, Fisheries, and Geomatic Sciences YouTube page. And you'll be able to access that using this QR code on the bottom of this screen. And then finally, as I mentioned at the top of the meeting, your feedback goes a long way in helping us provide more events like this, and it also helps to shape the way that we set up events like this. So we really do encourage you, when you're able to provide some of that feedback, and you can do so at this QR code. And I can also drop this in the chat. So thank you so much, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the recording now. And I think, Christian, if you can stay on for a couple minutes, I'll stay on for a couple minutes in case there's any lingering questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for everyone for coming out though, and I hope we get to interact in some capacity. Thanks,
Great.
Rachel. I really appreciate that.